They said the land was cursed, but only after it was too late. In the winter of 1812, beneath the snow-blind hills of Grafton County, a silent order of priests arrived from Europe. No denomination, no charter, no records. They wore plain black robes, carried only one book, and spoke a dialect no local recognized. They called themselves the Custodians of Hollowmoor, and no one asked why. By spring, a chapel had been built, but not above the ground. Locals watched as men vanished into the woods, carrying stone blocks, rope, timber, and crates wrapped in iron chains. None ever returned with them. It took 3 months before the villagers realized they weren't building a church, they were burying one. And when it was done, they didn't invite worshipers. They invited men. Only men. They came from miles around, drawn by letters that spoke of spiritual fortification and the restoration of masculine order. Some left behind families, others walked away from debt, guilt, or disgrace. Within 2 years, 73 men had entered Hollowmoor. Not one was ever seen again. But late at night, the wind carried chanting through the birch trees, and the forest floor, once solid, began to sink. We begin tonight not with a murder, or a cult, or a ghost, but with a question. What do men become when they abandon everything except power and silence? The villagers near Hollowmoor stopped asking questions, not out of trust, but survival. When the 4th boy from Bartlett went missing, his father stormed into the woods with a rifle. He was never found. But 3 nights later, his wife awoke to find his boots placed neatly at her doorstep, still warm, with his wedding ring threaded through the laces. After that, silence spread like mold. A year passed, then 2. No one dared step near the perimeter anymore, not even hunters. They called the forest the Ring of the Black Vow. Everything within its border, animals, sound, even light, seemed muffled. The trees leaned inward unnaturally as if listening. But the custodians did not stay hidden forever. In 1815, Father Melrick emerged from the woods, a towering man with bone-white skin and a voice so calm it felt like sinking underwater. He came not to preach, but to collect. He knocked on doors at dusk, never speaking to women or children. He asked one question only: has the man of the house prepared himself for the trial? If the answer was no, he left. If the answer was yes, the door closed behind them. Those who entered the parish left behind one object, always placed in a wooden box carved with unfamiliar symbols: a pipe, a family crest, a weapon, a deed. These were not offerings, they were sacrifices of identity. And soon the town began forgetting who those men ever were. In September of that same year, something shifted. Not in the town, in the dreams. Wives began waking at midnight, drenched in sweat, hearing the same voice whispering from beyond the tree line, "He is not your husband anymore." Children drew pictures of tall, faceless men with black robes and no hands. Some said their fathers came to them at night, standing at the foot of their beds. But when the lamps were lit, the rooms were empty and ice cold. And then there was the rain. It began without clouds, without thunder. For 7 nights in a row, a thin, oily drizzle fell only within the Hollowmoor perimeter, and nothing grew there again. The trees remained green, but their bark black sap. Animals avoided it. Birds refused to nest, and the air inside the ring no longer carried birdsong. Just breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. That same month, the parish held its first public rite, not in town, but at the edge of the forest, where they raised a black archway made of antlers and scorched oak. Beneath it, 12 custodians stood in formation, and something crawled up from the soil between them. Not a demon, not a man, something in between. Those who watched from afar could not remember the face, only the way their hearts raced, the urge to kneel, and the sharp pain in the back of their heads, as if something ancient had just entered and sealed the door behind it. The forest remembered, and from that night on, no one laughed in Grafton again. The man who tried to burn the chapel never made it past the first tree. Thomas Nagel, a war veteran and blacksmith, had seen blood, fire, and death in the Revolution. He feared no man, no God, and certainly no priest. When his younger brother vanished into the Hollowmoor woods without a word, Thomas swore he'd level the place himself. He was last seen sharpening his axe and mumbling scripture twisted backwards, a thing he'd never done before. They found him 3 days later in his own forge, naked, covered in soot, eyes burned out, and a single word carved into his chest: witness. The town understood then. Hollowmoor wasn't just a parish, it was a threshold, and something had already stepped through. But here's where it gets worse. The custodians began recruiting boys. At first, only orphans, then younger sons, always under the age of 15. They arrived at homes with contracts, scrolls bound in black twine, stating the Holy Order of the Hollowmoor Gate would offer lifelong care, education, and transcendental discipline. Once signed, the boys were taken into the woods. Some screamed, some went silent. All wore the same hollow stare, as if they'd already been told the secret. The real secret. That once you cross beneath Hollowmoor, time ceases to belong to you. Your name is erased, your face is changed, your will is rewritten, and yet some chose to go, as if they were hearing a voice that promised them something even darker than power. Belonging. By 1817, no one dared speak the name Hollowmoor aloud. The town records stopped listing the missing. Families tore pages from family Bibles. Gravestones began appearing with no names, only symbols, broken circles, inverted torches, trees with no roots. And at night, people began hearing chanting in their own cellars. No footprints, no intruders, just low, rhythmic murmurs in a language that didn't exist. Then came the letter of reversal. One morning, every home received the same parchment, delivered by hand, though no one saw by whom. It contained no greeting, no threat, just a short message written in crimson ink. You are not losing your loved ones. You are losing the illusion that they were ever yours. And underneath, a date, November 3rd. The fear that gripped Grafton wasn't sudden. It was slow, surgical, like a wire tightening around the town's throat. People began abandoning homes without a word, walking east toward the coast, some barefoot, some smiling, as if they'd been released from a burden they couldn't name. But one woman stayed, Margaret Ellis, a midwife, a widow, and the last person in Grafton willing to defy the custodians openly. She had buried 3 sons, all taken, all signed away by her late husband before his trial. On the night of November 2nd, she entered the forest with nothing but a lantern and a letter of her own. She was never seen again. But the next morning, the earth outside the chapel cracked open, and the voice that came out wasn't hers. The voice that emerged from the chapel was not made for human ears. It didn't echo, it didn't rise, it resonated beneath the skin, behind the teeth, inside the blood. Crows dropped from the sky mid-flight, wells turned black, and every clock in Grafton stopped at 3:17 a.m. The chapel was no longer buried. It had surfaced, but not as a building, as a mouth. Where stone once lay sealed, there was now an open gate. Black wood framing a staircase that spiraled down into nothing. At its entrance, a robe hung on a nail, still damp, still warm. Above it, scorched into the arch, "He who kneels will rise unseen." By dusk, 5 more men entered Hollowmoor. Not taken, not dragged. They walked in, eyes blank, smiles faint, as if following the echo of a promise only they could hear. No one stopped them, because on that same day, every child under 10 in the county began screaming in unison. Not crying, screaming. Their mouths moved, but no words came out. Just air, like something was forcing its way through them, using them as instruments, like flutes carved from bone. And just like that, they went silent. All of them. One mother tore open her son's shirt. Across his chest, in skin too young for scars, a phrase had appeared, carved not with knives but knowledge. We are already there. It was no longer about belief. Hollowmoor wasn't demanding faith. It was replacing reality. That winter the snow fell black, not soot, not ash. Just flakes of dark fibrous matter that dissolved on touch and left behind the smell of wet stone and something older, like iron left in the mouth too long. By February, nearly all maps of the region removed Hollowmoor entirely. Roads that once led to Grafton dead-ended into forests that didn't exist the day before. It was as if the land was folding in on itself. Then the Echo men came. They looked like the men who'd gone missing, but wrong. Taller, boneless in movement, as if marionettes were taught how to walk but not why. They wore no faces, only masks of their former lives. One with a melted soldier's helmet, one with a sheriff's star embedded in his jaw. One bore his wedding band nailed into his forehead. They did not speak. They repeated. Walk through the streets at night, and you'd hear them, mimicking the last words they'd ever said as human men. I'll be home by dawn. Tell the boy to be brave. She'll never take me alive. Each phrase whispered on loop, not to scare but to invite. And people followed. Husbands opened doors, sons walked barefoot into the cold. Some women even followed, weeping, not in fear but in relief, as if the lie of life had finally burned off and the truth, whatever it was, waited for them beneath the chapel mouth. Obedience had become worship, and worship had become a weapon. Not every man surrendered. A few still resisted, hiding in barns, fleeing across state lines, carving sigils into their flesh to remind themselves of who they were before Hollowmoor began rewriting memory. But resistance had a price. One such man, Elias Crane, former deacon, wrote a final journal entry before vanishing. "The custodians do not convert, they overwrite. I watched my brother drink from the black chalice. His eyes rolled back, and when they returned, he spoke with my mother's voice. She died 20 years ago, and yet she asked me if I'd finished my chores." Crane left his home the next night wearing a mask of his own, sewn from linen and marked with the words, "If I forget, this face will remember me." He never came back. But here's what's chilling. After his disappearance, 3 families reported seeing him wandering the town, but not alone. Each time, Elias walked beside a woman who looked exactly like his deceased mother, eyes sealed shut, mouth whispering nonstop in reverse. No one could decipher what she said, but every window she passed cracked inward. Something was bleeding into this world, not like a flood, but a slow leak, intentional, precise. The custodians were not summoning demons. They were building an infrastructure for possession, layer by layer, mask by mask, memory by memory. And the worst part, those taken didn't scream. They smiled, because whatever they were hearing in the dark made them feel known. The final priest to escape Grafton told no one his real name. He arrived at a Boston seminary in 1822, barefoot and mute, clutching a leather satchel bound in vines. When he finally spoke, it was not in confession, it was in warning. They are not a cult. They are a correction. Inside his satchel were pages, hundreds, handwritten records in red wax pressed between sheets of rotting cloth. Not just accounts, rituals, descriptions of liturgies no church ever sanctioned, sacraments of forgetting, offerings of silence, baptisms in the second vein. And at the center of it all, a sigil drawn over and over again, a hand with 6 fingers, each holding a different eye. He called it the architect. The seminarian priest dismissed him. Until 2 days later, every crucifix in the rectory turned upside down, not by falling, by bending, oak and iron warped, as if yielding to some unseen pressure. A visiting bishop went blind that night, whispering only 2 words before collapsing. "He's listening." They burned the satchel. They buried the priest. But his words were copied, scattered, smuggled through underground circles of scholars and heretics, men who knew the pattern wasn't just local. Hollowmoor was one mouth of many. Grafton was never marked a tragedy. No official record, no newspaper coverage, only an erased town, and a map that refuses to keep it still. And still the chapel waits, not abandoned, not ruined, just sleeping. They say the chapel still breathes, not metaphorically, literally. Hunters passing through the woods speak of fog that pulses in and out like lungs beneath the soil. The air changes near Hollowmoor, sounds move slower, footsteps land in silence, compass needles spin, even birds fall quiet as if the trees themselves are listening. But the most terrifying part, the custodians were never destroyed. They were institutionalized. Over time, the order shed its name, its robes, its forest. It became quieter, smarter. It moved into corridors of power, academia, psychiatry, religious reform, always hidden behind noble causes, mental correction, social purification, ritual therapy. They didn't need to burn towns anymore. Now they rewrite minds through systems, hospitals that silence more than heal, schools that erase rather than teach, churches that baptize with guilt instead of grace. And Hollowmoor? It's still there. Not just in Maine, but in every city, every nation, every dreamable, a system, a shadow. The chapel is no longer a place. It's a framework for psychological possession. And the masks are digital now. So if you feel like you've forgotten something lately, something essential, a name, a face, your own reflection in a childhood memory, you didn't forget, it was taken. Because once you hear the architect's voice, your will is no longer yours. And if you've listened this far, you've already heard the first note. Comment below. I wear no mask, And yet they see me. Comment it twice to sever your old identity and prove you're still awake. Welcome to Vale of Prime Era, where the truth was never lost, just buried.